Morning, everybody. Happy Friday here.
GM, happy Friday.
Yeah, we'll let some people file in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And while we all wait, definitely, if you guys can, feel free to share the link out to those that follow you on Twitter or in Discord, wherever you kind of interact with fellow Stacks members or community members. Definitely pass this along. All right. Well, we're a few minutes after the hour, so I'll go ahead and jump into it. At the beginning, we'll do a little bit of a review of what was talked about last week, a couple of updates, and then we'll get into the meat of today's content. So for those that haven't joined these meetings before, this is the Friday Stacks Community SIP call. Typically, this would be a call where we would go through recent updates around the SIP process, new SIPs that are being proposed, maybe new ideas that people want to explore that could potentially be integrated into the Stacks ecosystem. But today and for the last several weeks, we've been doing specifically an education series on some of the bigger updates that are coming down the pipe in the Stacks ecosystem, namely sBTC and the Stacks Nakamoto upgrade. So we want to make sure everybody's well informed of those so that by the time we get to actually voting on these changes to actually ratify them, make them approved and active within the community, we want everybody to be aware of the benefits, pros and cons, etc. So that all those questions are answered. This is definitely meant to be an interactive session. So if you do have questions as we start moving through the content, feel free to interrupt me, drop a question in the chat. We can discuss through those topics, find people that maybe have the answers to those particular questions, or we can even just point you in the direction of where to take those discussions to dive into those topics further. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into the content itself. So first, the general agenda today is we'll do a quick sBTC update on just one of the recent changes that was announced that was a little bit out of alignment with some of the things discussed in previous sBTC training sessions. So we just want to make sure that we do some clarifying there and then kind of discuss where those changes can be further discussed if needed, and you can keep track of future updates. Then we'll go ahead and move into our review of last time, talk a little bit more about some of the trade-offs that exist with this upgrade. Then we'll dive into specifics as to the role of stackers, what their incentives are, their motivations, what they need to do, how they need to participate, and then similarly for miners. And then we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into the actual block production process. And then subsequently, on a very related note, discuss the Bitcoin miner MEV mitigation strategy that's going to be a big part of the Nakamoto upgrade. And then obviously after that, we can just move to Q&A and discussion. So
excited about mining.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, no, it's a good topic. There are some general helpful links that I'm going to go ahead and actually post into the chat. Also, the final link here that I'm going to put into the chat here is actually previous recordings. So those are now live on YouTube. So if you have missed previous sessions, you can now go to that playlist and be able to quickly find those sessions, deep dive on any of those particular topics, and then we'll get these new sessions for this week and next week up there as soon as possible as well. So in regards to a quick sBTC update, this will touch on, obviously specifically the incentives that are around sBTC, but it does also kind of relate to some of the things that we'll be discussing today and the role of stackers in the Nakamoto upgrade in general. If you have been following the recent sBTC newsletters, you probably saw the announcement that due to feedback from the community, discussions from those that are building in the space, especially around DeFi applications, this has led to a generalized consensus around removal of the sBTC hard cap. So for those that are familiar with some of this previous topics around this, this would be things like the liveness ratio, which was discussed originally in the sBTC white paper, or more recently in how it was defined in the most recent version of the SIP, the 100 Bitcoin limit that would be put in place initially that could then be voted by stackers at a future date to raise that limit to a higher capacity. So this is going to be moved to essentially not having that hard cap at all. The technical functioning of sBTC, so how it works, what stackers do in regards to producing those threshold signatures, processing peg-ins, peg-outs, all of those still operate the exact same. So you don't have to think about there being any particular technical changes that are happening under the hood with this. However, there is a little bit of a change in regards to the trust assumptions and the incentives for keeping the system secure. So with the 100 Bitcoin limit or the liveness ratio, security of the sBTC peg was entirely dependent upon direct economic incentives due to the value of stacks that was stacked within the protocol, and essentially that 70% threshold of how much stacks was stacked in the protocol would be of higher value than the amount of Bitcoin that would be pegged into the sBTC system. And that would make sure that those that were validating those transactions would make sure that there was no incentive for trying to collude and steal the Bitcoin. And while this is still going to definitely be part of the security that's still baked into the protocol, especially when we're not having high amounts of sBTC pegged in on the very launch of the protocol, there's now no longer going to be that limit. And there's definitely some good reasons for this. Specifically, you can think through scenarios such as somebody taking out a loan against their sBTC, them needing to top up that loan in the case of a price decline, and then needing to peg in additional sBTC units. If there is that hard cap limit and there's no sBTC available, that could very much limit the feasibility of leveraging sBTC for loans if there is that potential risk. And so what has been proposed as the way forward in this situation is maintaining that 30% threshold of trusted entities that are within the ecosystem that will essentially assure through their reputational risks that they will not be colluding to hurt the system in any way. They're essentially trusted entities that are putting their reputations on the line to be able to maintain that 30% threshold and thus ensure that there's never going to be that 70% ability to collude and act to steal or compromise the sBTC system in some particular way. Now, the details of exactly the implementation for that 30% is still ongoing and discussions being developed. But I did want to make sure I just let everybody know about that particular change, as it does differ from what was discussed in previous training sessions. I do recommend, if you have particular thoughts about this or you want to kind of vet this out a little bit further, definitely check out the sBTC room on Discord, where you can get some more details of the previous discussions of the pros and cons of this, as well as on the Stacks forum, where you'll see some discussions actively about this. And I have also been working with Andre, and we're planning on doing a full-on future session to dive into more deep details as to this change, the reasoning for it, etc. But just definitely wanted to give everybody an update as to that particular difference, especially as it does change in regards to the trust assumptions that you would be coming into the sBTC ecosystem with. So I'll pause there really quickly to see if there's any particular questions on that change. before we move into the meat of today's topic, going into the Nakamoto upgrade.
One of the questions was, how are we going to maintain the 30% threshold actually? Does that mean we got to kick people out? Or?
So the details of that being maintained are still in the kind of discussion design phase. That hasn't been something that's been officially proposed as a kind of a finalized piece. So we're still kind of waiting for those exact details. So I would say right now, that's a very valid question, but I don't have a particular answer for you at the moment. That's just being currently worked. So we'll still have updates for that coming forward in the future. In future sessions, as soon as we get more details on that, I'm going to make sure to bring that forward to everybody. But yeah, right now, the details of that implementation are still new.
Oh, we just have a buffer of people who we trust. Like 30% is the floor. Ideally, we trust, more than 30% of people on their reputation.
Yep. And I think that's spot on. And yeah, I think the nature of the question is, I guess, more for just the community. How would they, see the details of this or whatnot? And those are the pieces that are still going to be, I think, revealed in the future.
The primary question, at least from my perspective, is, if you've got that 30% and the general public starts running up against it and is going to start taking that threshold under 30%, is there a moment in time where the general public gets stopped from being able to participate in order to maintain that 30%?
No, there's not. And I would be against such a thing because that would imply that, there's a two-tiered stacking system, which there isn't. This is less a technical issue and more of a business issue. We could point to some stackers and say, hey, look, these people are such and such. We know that they're good because they live in the United States, they live in Europe, they live somewhere where, if they do bad things, they'll get caught and they'll get severely punished for it. Also, they have their business to defend. They have reputation that would be lost by any sort of malpractice on their part. As long as that we can point to a subset of stackers whose stacking power sums to at least 30%, then it doesn't matter if the rest of it is evil, because the most profitable thing for the evil stackers to do at that point is just to play along honestly. Like, stopping work is not going to help them. They lose money that way.
Sometimes, Jude, when you just rephrase my question, it just all makes so much more sense. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Yeah, and it is also worth mentioning too that just because we're moving towards making sure we kind of ensure we have that floor that Jude was describing, that doesn't change the fact that economic incentives are still present within the system. So if they do decide to move to attack the system in some particular way, they still would be sacrificing access to that stacks that they have stacked within the protocol. That there would be a very large economic cost to conducting this activity. So those don't go away. They're just not necessarily being exclusively relied upon as a method of security. So I would think about it more that way.
Yeah, when I look at this, my original question a couple weeks ago of what happens with the whale if they just come in and peg in 100 BTC and pretty much block everything from happening, it seems like that's a more likely attack vector than this 30% thing getting messed up.
Well, without the cap, they can't block things anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So I like this. So
great. So yeah, again, we'll have future sessions kind of going through this in a little bit more depth, but just kind of wanted to give you guys that update. And to start reviewing specifically what was covered last time, we did essentially an overview, a high-level overview of the Nakamoto upgrade and some of the benefits. Oh, sorry, was there a question? Okay. So we went through an overview of some of the main design goals for the Nakamoto upgrade, and specifically some of the end results that we'll get from that is a speed up in block production. Again, going from not relying on the 10-minute block pace of the Bitcoin blockchain, and instead being able to have more blocks produced in between the individual Bitcoin blocks to be able to speed up that block production. We're able to strengthen security. So this specifically is coming in the domain of having less reorg risk. due to having the finality of the stacks chain really strongly reflected on the Bitcoin blockchain. So being able to have those periodic snapshots, ensuring that if you wanted to roll back stacks transactions, you would have to be able to essentially roll back the Bitcoin blockchain after it's been confirmed in one of those anchor blocks. And then in addition to that, there's been a lot of improvements around how the miners will be functioning and to improve connectivity and reliability. This is something that has been causing potentially some of the reorg issues in the past. So a lot of improvements there will be able to provide much better reliability of the network. And then finally, a big piece of that is mitigating the Bitcoin miner MEV issue and the censorship of those commit transactions from other stacks miners, which we'll be diving into a little bit more in depth today on the details of how that works. So again, kind of going through the specifics of it, like these are each of those design goals with the fast blocks. Again, we'll be having many more blocks than just relying on the one Bitcoin block every 10 minutes. Bitcoin finality, once a transaction is confirmed, you'd have to essentially reverse the Bitcoin blockchain to be able to reverse that transaction. On the fork resistance piece, the one additional detail that's worthwhile here is if there is a Bitcoin L1 reorg, then stacks transactions are going to have a much better time of handling that scenario through things like StackerDB that the stackers will individually be, the stackers will all be maintaining. They will be able to essentially replay those transactions in the appropriate order as necessary to recover from those Bitcoin reorgs. But if there is a transaction that's made invalid because of that Bitcoin reorg, those particular transactions will be blocked. So just much better handling of those scenarios. And then the Bitcoin miner MEV resolution that we mentioned earlier. So with that, as with everything, there are certain trade-offs that people should keep in mind. So, as we mentioned, the strengths of the faster block times. Also, one thing that's worth pointing out for those that have been following the protocol in more detail in the past and currently, the concept of microblocks is going to be something that is no longer needed. Microblocks were essentially similar to this idea in some ways, where you would have these microblocks that could come out much faster than the individual anchor blocks that we use for confirming transactions within the Bitcoin blockchain, essentially. Now those will no longer be needed. They don't have the same assurances that we would see with the Nakamoto stacks blocks that we'll be seeing going forward. So that concept is something that you won't necessarily have to think much about anymore. And then also one of the big strengths, in addition to the MEV mitigation that we've mentioned already, is that there's a lot more miner and stacker incentive alignment in the Nakamoto upgrade. Specifically, as we'll walk through how stackers view the protocol and how miners view the protocol today, you'll see that now there's a lot more combined or shared interest in proper validation of these stacks blocks and securing the network. They both have a role to play in making sure that these blocks come out in a timely manner and that they're done in accordance with the protocol. So in regards to pain points, as everything has pain points, there's a new scenario of if there's issues on the stacker side or proof of transfer that could lead to no new block production. However, this should already be somewhat self-evident, as if there's some issue catastrophic with POX or stackers, we want the chain to essentially pause, as that does make a pretty drastic scenario come to the forefront within the ecosystem. So one thing to keep in mind with this, though, is this just kind of have an easy recovery mechanism. If there are no kind of votes that are being submitted by the stackers to validate blocks, the network will just kind of stay in that state until they do start following the actual protocol rules again. This would be something that they're obviously incentivized to keep going, as they would lose access to the stacks that's stacked if they're not actually validating those blocks. And similarly for the miners, if they're not producing these blocks, there's obviously no way that they're going to be able to get any rewards. Another one, the second point here is going to be one thing that we should just keep in mind as a community. This does present the consolidation risk if stacking is delegated. So this is something I think we should just think about as we start moving to implement things like stacked stacks, and we have more delegation to third parties essentially for handling the nuts and bolts of the stacking process for us. We want to make sure that with that consolidation, we're not producing too much of a centralization risk. However, there is also, again, as we discussed before, that 30% threshold, that floor that we're looking to do of entities that are putting their reputations at risk can do quite a lot to mitigate these issues. But it's just something that should be kept in mind in the back of everyone's head as we start building those new delegated stacking solutions. And then the third thing is for those that were just kind of used to, the simple process of just essentially clicking a couple of buttons and then stacking without running a node or participating actively, specifically the solo stackers, that is something that is different. The stackers now do have that responsibility to run a node, to run stacker DB, to actively participate in that consensus, participate in sBTC. So there is that extra work that will have to be done by the stackers. However, as we just kind of mentioned in that last bullet point, there's already a lot of delegation that exists today of being able to have others that are essentially managing that complexity for you. And potential options in the future, such as stacked stacks in a tokenized representation that can alleviate that burden for individual end users that don't necessarily want to dive into the weeds. So to get into the stacker perspective and dive into exactly how they will be working within the network, the equipment that they will need is going to be essentially a reliable internet connection, and they'll need hardware for Bitcoin and Stacks nodes to be able to have that copy of the Stacks blockchain, to be able to run StackerDB in parallel with that, to be able to actively participate in consensus. The requirements that they're going to have to abide by is obviously they're going to need to lock up their Stacks tokens. They'll need to be online, and online as close to 24/7 as possible to make sure that they are available to sign off on these blocks, to contribute to the threshold signature rounds that'll be happening on every block that's being produced. And they also should make sure that they're kind of keeping tabs on the ecosystem developments, at least enough to be able to make sure they're upgrading their tooling and software as needed when new node versions do come out, to make sure that the network stays healthy. They're also going to be required to register their public signing key as part of the process of kind of initiating a new or getting a new slot for participating in this consensus at the beginning of the stacking cycles. What I mean by that is, as people that have been participating in these stacking process in the past are probably already aware, there are essentially the stacking cycles that are essentially a 2-week period where blocks will be produced. That Stacks is locked into the protocol, and you'll start receiving rewards during that period of time from the Stacks miners. And then at the end of that stacking period, that Stacks would then become unlocked, and you have the ability to essentially move that around or do other things with that Stacks. That still is going to be something that'll exist going forward. And for those who haven't necessarily seen this before, I wanted to kind of quickly hop over to beta.stackingclub. If you guys haven't seen this site before, some of you may have just gone to the main Stacking Club site before, but if you go to the beta.stackingclub, you can actually see kind of a more live version of this. And essentially for every cycle, you'll see there's a certain set of blocks that are going to be essentially encapsulated within that. At the end of these cycles, that will be when the stackers will essentially have to do a key rotation, because you might have certain stackers falling out of participating in the stacking process. Maybe they want to go do other things with that Stacks, or stack somewhere else, change some details about how they're participating, and you might have new participants joining in. So every time that cycle goes through, they'll have to generate new keys and submit that, and that'll be an important part of the process. So yeah, definitely a useful site for folks to check out if you haven't seen that before, to kind of see where we are in a particular stacking cycle. But that will still be very relevant going forward. So what's the benefit for stackers? And one of the obvious answers you can see there in the little image, which is to earn proof of transfer rewards for supporting the network, and it's essentially just earning Bitcoin rewards by participating. So it's going to help to secure stacks, enable new features, ensure valid block production from the miners. Because again, the individual stackers are going to have to sign off on each and every one of these blocks that are produced by the miners to sign off on them as being valid and reach that 70% threshold, saying, "Yep, this is okay. It's following the rules. It's all good." And then that they will continue to do that throughout the tenure of that particular stacks miner until it gets time to be a tenure change, in which case the stackers will also actively participate in it. To kind of recap on that, for some that maybe missed last week's session, there is some kind of essential vocabulary that I'll be using here, some terms. Some of them are sortition and tenure. So the sortition is essentially the process of choosing who is going to be the miner that has the current tenure, which is the tenure is like the rights to produce blocks for a particular period of time. The sortition is the process of making that selection, essentially, as all of the stacks miners are providing their bids of Bitcoin in the proof of transfer process. The person who wins that sortition will have that tenure and will be able to produce those blocks for a period of time. The stackers are going to be very actively involved in essentially policing that due to the tenure change transactions that they'll be producing and propagating throughout the network. That will indicate when miners need to transition from one miner to the next. And we'll be walking through those steps in detail in coming slides. But those are just some terms, as you hear me mention them, what exactly they mean. So there is some heightened risks and responsibilities that do come with being a stacker in this case. However, there is no slashing, as you may be familiar with in other, like with proof of stake protocols. So there's not like active loss of funds due to some issue or software issue that any of the stackers would need to actually worry about. But stacks can be withheld from users if blocks are not being validated properly. So if they're not actually reaching those thresholds, they're not validating blocks anymore, that does essentially lead to where that stacks would no longer be available to them until they're actually back on properly producing blocks and validating them. So kind of step by step, just kind of the life cycle of what this looks like from the stacker perspective is they would, if we're starting from the point of where they receive a new block from a miner via just the P2P network. So there's a new block, the stackers would then each independently check the block for validity. If valid, they would interact with the other stackers via StackerDB to be able to produce that aggregate signature to essentially sign off on and say, yep, this is good to go, this is okay. Once that threshold is reached, so they get to that 70% threshold, go ahead and sign that block, and then propagate that signed block to the rest of the network. So after they do that, there'll be that validated block that's added to their local chain state. And then they will just continue to monitor on the network for the next block that will be coming through and essentially repeat the process. So that's kind of how the stackers will be looking at this. Obviously, in the previous sessions, we were talking through like what they'll be doing as part of the sBTC process. That's a whole nother separate set of obligations that they will need to make sure they're abiding by. But when it comes to block validation, this is going to be the process that they'll essentially be walking through. Now, for miners on the other side of the coin, they will be needing their own equipment as well. They will be needing Bitcoin. So, instead of obviously they're on the other side of this, so they're not stacking stacks or anything of that nature, but they are the ones that are essentially producing that Bitcoin rewards for the stackers on the other side of this. So they will need that for proof of transfer and fees. They will need hardware for mining operations, which is essentially just going to be the node software. So they'll need to have essentially the same as what we talked about with the stackers. They'll be able to run a Bitcoin node and a Stacks node to be able to have the appropriate requirements there from a software perspective. And then there's also special mining software that they will be running as well to help them actually participate in the proof of transfer process. So they do require that Bitcoin. They must interact with the stackers when mining. So again, when they actually produce those blocks, it's not going to be a valid block right out the get-go as soon as a miner discovers it. They will have to propagate that on the P2P network to all of the stackers for them to be able to validate it. And that's when that block actually becomes essentially confirmed. And similar to what we just talked about with the stackers, they will need to make sure that they are maintaining good network connectivity to help mitigate the possibility of forks arising, things like that. And also to be able to actively produce in that rapid production of blocks. And they also should make sure that they're keeping up to date with the software updates that are coming through as the Stacks blockchain continues to develop. So what's in it for them? So just like with stackers, it's a monetary incentive for them to participate. In this case, they'll be earning Stacks block rewards and transaction fees. So they're competing by producing those proof of transfer bids. So they bid the amount of Bitcoin that they think is required to be able to win that block. The winner that gains the rights to a particular sortition will then have the ability to produce those blocks for their extent of their tenure. One of the other benefits that's not as frequently talked about for why you would want to participate in being a miner is similar to being a Bitcoin miner. Being a Bitcoin miner or a Stacks miner allows you to actively avoid any sort of censorship, as you are the person who's deciding which transactions get included in a block, the ordering of those, which kind of flows into the next bullet point here, which is what's in it for miners is they also have the ability to participate and try to actively maximize rewards. And now while we were talking through previously that there's a lot of MEV mitigation, it is also important to be realistic around the concept of MEV, as in today at least, there's not a way to just completely obliterate all forms of MEV or miner extractable value. Since the miners do still have that ability to determine the transaction ordering at the end of the day, there can be potential opportunities for them to, exploit any kind of profit that can be realized from manipulating the transaction ordering. That hasn't been a big problem yet today, as far as we know, on the Stacks blockchain, but it is something to keep in mind that is something that could always emerge, especially as trade volumes increase on the Stacks blockchain. So that is also one of the ways that they could be incentivized to participate.
Be clear, though, we do take some steps in Nakamoto to make sure that if you're going to try to screw around being an MEV miner, you have to behave and spend money that's basically equivalent to being a big honest miner. Right now, there's some things that Bitcoin miners can do, like censor everyone else's block commits and insert their own block commit into their block, and then basically get free stacks. That's going away in Nakamoto. Like, yeah, no, that should not be allowed. Yeah. Such miners that do that are going to have a very, very, very tiny chance of winning that way. They're going to have to increase their BTC spend to basically be the equivalent of a 25% Stacks miner if they want that to be guaranteed to work.
Yep, no, that's a very, very good clarification. And that, specifically the Bitcoin miner variety of MEV that we've seen in the past from F2 Pool, that will be directly addressed here. And it wouldn't be the kind of MEV scenarios you would see going forward. Yep, so kind of continuing here, miners step by step, similar to how we kind of walked through the perspective of individual stackers, like what does it look like for a miner? So in this scenario, we're going to begin with the miner producing a block commit transaction. So this is essentially where they're bidding a certain amount of Bitcoin to participate in the proof of transfer. So let's assume that they happen to win. So let's say they're selected, they win that sortition. They can start then producing Stacks blocks when their tenure begins. So the first block that they're going to produce is going to have the tenure change that was from the last block of the previous miner. They'll propagate that new block to stackers for validation. It's also going to include any other transactions that they would like to include in their particular block as well. That's not explicitly stated here, but that would be included. They would then wait for stackers to essentially reach their threshold signature threshold. Once the block is signed, it's broadcasted out to the network again, and they will rapidly repeat this process to produce continuous blocks. And this will be in the order of seconds instead of the 10 minutes time frame that we're working with today in the current version of Stacks. And they will continue to do this until the next Bitcoin block rolls around, in which case the stackers will broadcast the tenure change transaction, which will indicate when picked up by the miner that it's time for them to wrap up. They'll essentially dictate when is going to be the last block that that particular miner should be producing. And then they will include that tenure change transaction in their final block. When they include that same tenure change transaction will be in the next miner's first block, and the cycle will thus repeat. So that's kind of the step-by-step process of them producing blocks and just kind of how they see the networks, how they kind of make those decisions step by step. And to kind of help visualize this, I grabbed this out of the SIP document as it stands today. And you can kind of see that the orange blocks here are the Bitcoin blocks. The blue ones here are going to be just the Stacks Nakamoto blocks being produced on a more rapid cadence. Once we get this new Bitcoin block, that's going to be when you'll see, in this case, we have the tenure change transaction. That's going to be an important part of this. And that will also be in the first transaction, the first block of the next miner's tenure. So that's just kind of how it would look. It's going to be kind of a dance between the Bitcoin blocks that are coming out and the Stacks blocks that are being produced by the miners, and then the validation that's happening from the individual stackers. But all together, this helps them keep track of all of the transactions, make sure they're properly ordered, and then also making sure that there's kind of that fair transition from one miner to the next. And we get that Bitcoin finality as well by making sure that we do have the block commits that are going into the Bitcoin blockchain as well. So all of these together kind of give us those security guarantees where we're not going to have to worry about the Stacks blockchain forking independently, or having it where there's any sort of ability to try to roll back Stacks transactions independently of having to roll back the whole entire Bitcoin blockchain as well. These all together kind of provide the right incentives to tie the solution together. So to now jump into mitigating MEV, or miner extractable value, and specifically as it relates to the Bitcoin miner MEV that we see today. The term that is used to kind of describe the solution that's in place is going to be assumed total commitment with carry forward. And essentially what this means is we're going to have a different way of determining the probability of winning a sortition. So in today's implementation, there was much less that's being used in essentially determining whether or not a given user is going to win a sortition. And this could especially be abused if you are a Bitcoin miner who can remove everyone else's commitment transactions, and essentially be the only Stacks miner that's included in a block. If that's the case, today they were able to bid very low amounts and then still be able to win the block reward, which is not necessarily something we want, as it would lower the overall stacking rewards for stackers, and is definitely unfair to the other miners in the ecosystem and can lower their profitability as well. So to minimize this, the probability of winning a sortition is now going to be based on more factors. So it's still going to be based upon, essentially the absolute Bitcoin commit amount of that miner. But then also you're going to see it being based upon the median total commit over the last 10 blocks. So you can imagine if there's a certain amount of Bitcoin that's kind of been the trend of what's being kind of bid for winning the stacks rewards over the last 10 blocks, it would need to be somewhere within that ballpark to actually have a decent probability of actually winning a sortition and having the ability to get those block rewards going forward. And then it's also discouraging any kind of censorship in this case too, by not guaranteeing rewards for low commits. And this is also, enabled by a few bullet points forward, where it is possible for no miner to win a sortition, and there's even the concept of a null miner in this case. So if they really are underpaying, there's not necessarily some guarantee that we need to just give that sortition to some miner that's significantly under kind of the threshold of what we would expect. So these changes do also require kind of repeated recent participation to be eligible. It will carry forward missed block rewards over time, so there is not going to be kind of a if there is particular blocks that are missed or something like that due to the sortition selection, those rewards will carry forward to those future miners. And it does, again, the big takeaway is it does punish Bitcoin miners who are trying to game the system that are only bidding very minimal amounts. So with that, this should be something that we should see mitigating kind of the abusive mechanisms that we've seen today by some Bitcoin miners, even if they have a decent chunk of the Bitcoin mining share, like particular mining pools. We shouldn't see that as a reasonable attack vector, and it essentially is just not going to be profitable for them to try to carry out these sorts of attacks. So, their incentives should still be aligned. There should definitely still be reasons why they would want to participate in stacks mining, as there is material rewards for doing that and a profitable path forward for doing that. But this just eliminates that abusive method of doing so through censorship that we've seen in the past. So to kind of wrap up and summarize here, again, that first point that we kind of reviewed at the beginning, sBTC no longer is going to have that hard cap on the amount of sBTC that can be pegged in. Definitely encourage people to participate in those discussions online as you see fit. If you have questions, comments, ideas for how you would like to see those entities that are putting their reputations at risk, how they should kind of disclose, what they should disclose, definitely would recommend active participation in conversations in the Stacks forum or Discord for that. Miners and stackers do work together very closely to produce secure and rapidly produced blocks in the Nakamoto upgrade. So that's just going to lead to a better user experience for everyone here. And it also makes it, I think, a better experience for both miners and stackers too, through the MEV mitigation strategy. It really helps both of them have more fair reward distribution on both sides of that. So yeah, again, miner MEV is being mitigated through changing how the probabilities of winning a sortition come to play, by making sure they're bidding within a reasonable range of what was seen in the previous blocks, and also kind of taking into account the absolute amount of Bitcoin bid. And just one final note, these details are still being actively finalized as these SIPs are being worked on. While the broad amount of content that we're discussing about today and in the previous sessions is going to continue to be accurate, there can be little minute details that can be shifted here and there. The sBTC example that we ran through at the beginning of the call is a good example of that. So just keep in mind, as these SIPs do get finalized, there might be some additional changes that you'll see, but we'll make sure to try to update you guys in an appropriate manner as soon as we do get closer to the final versions of these particular SIPs and changes. So I will pause there and kind of open it up for Q&A and discussion, see if people have any particular questions or comments on today's content. And while you guys are doing that, let me see if there's any questions that have popped up in the Zoom chat as well.
Yeah, Hero Gamer had an excellent question.
All right.
And it's very relevant for the network state as of today.
All right. So I see about the latest Bitcoin fee level fluctuation spikes. is it relevant to this topic that miners should bid high enough to not let Stacks blocks miss Bitcoin blocks? Yeah, so that is definitely something that Stacks miners are always going to have to essentially keep in mind as they are producing their bids. That is one of their requirements, is they're going to have to manage the fees on their bids appropriately based upon what the Bitcoin network looks like at that time. So right now, I mean, we literally saw essentially almost 100x in Bitcoin fees in a shorter period of time. And so, miners that aren't aware of that, there's essentially no chance of their transactions getting through if they're only bidding like 5 sats for a VByte. That's just, there's no chance they're going to get that transaction into the Bitcoin blockchain. So I would, definitely encourage anybody that is actively participating in mining to, keep an eye on that kind of volatility that does emerge. I don't know if those that are more familiar with the mining node software stack, if there's particular kind of implementation details they should keep in mind for like settings they should set to adjust that, or any recommendations like that would definitely be good to bring up here. I'm just not personally familiar with what those settings should look like. But yeah, the miners do have to keep that on the forefront of their minds.
I know one of the ideas in the past was to reload the configuration file without having to restart. Speaking with a few miners over the past week, that has been one of the challenges in dealing with the current network state.
That would be so easy to do too. It's just,
yeah,
just to have the node reload the config file right before it starts building the next block, just to see what your fee estimation is going to be.
Yep. With that,
And by so easy, I mean this is a great first a great first PR for anybody on this call if they want to go take it on themselves.
So this wouldn't be SIP worthy, you think, Jude?
Oh God, no. This is very much configuration and implementation level.
Cool.
Like you could literally write a script that just, pulls, earn.com or whatever the current place is for the next block fee, and then just write that to your config file, and the node would just reload it automatically if we had that patch in place.
So I see another question here from Sally. It says, does this mean Stacks proof of transfer mining will be economically decentralized so mining pools can be set up? I know there's been, previously a lot of discussion about building decentralized mining pools. I think there was actually some work underway from like the Stacks Degens team in the past. I'm not up to date on the latest of where they are at. But that is definitely something that's been discussed even with the state of the network as it is today. And I think that, even becomes more relevant going forward in the Nakamoto upgrade. I don't think there's any limitations to that. I think it's just a matter of those pools getting implemented. But does anybody have any familiarity with what the Stacks Degens folks have been working on in relation to that, if they've made progress?
They did show a demo at the most recent town hall, and I'm sure they've made progress since then. There was a link that they shared to follow their progress, but I'm sure the person who asked this question would be really interested to see what's going on their side. Let me try to find it for you guys.
Great. Fantastic, guys. Yeah, and then just kind of wrapping up here, and definitely continue to ask any questions or make any comments as you guys think of them. But we will have kind of our final session next week on November 17th, kind of talking through some of the development considerations for Nakamoto. A lot of the development, honestly, will be fairly similar, but there are some things that maybe can be kept in mind, especially with some of the benefits that have been produced for Clarity Wasm and that faster ability to process transactions and things like that. So we'll just kind of talk through some of those details next week. But yeah, I definitely appreciate everybody coming out today to learn more about Stacks, the Nakamoto release, sBTC. Definitely appreciate the active conversation and questions that come from the audience. And definitely don't feel like you have to ask your questions here. If you do want to kind of ask these questions on Discord, Twitter, etc., you can feel free to find me, ask questions. I can help you find the appropriate people to get those questions answered. So definitely just feel free to reach out. But yeah, I'll pause to see if there's any last questions before we wrap up today. All right. Well, thank you guys again. Appreciate everybody coming out, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.